Hey you folks, Quilly18 here, and welcome to another Unity tutorial where we make a simple 2D space shooter. So at this point, we've gotten to where we can fly around with our ship. We are constrained by the screen bounds, and we've got this alien, this enemy around here that is currently not doing anything. And we want to be able to crash into it to start off with, and then we're going to want to be able to shoot it as well. So what we have to do at this point is we have to talk about colliders, triggers, rigid bodies, and kinematic rigid bodies, because this can often confuse people. So we did a quick demo earlier, and I'm going to sort of repeat the demo a little bit. Let me take this enemy. I'm going to give it a collider. Specifically, I'm going to go ahead and give it a box collider 2D. Okay, there's the box collider and there's a box collider 2D. We're doing everything in 2D, so use the 2D versions. Then we're going to give it a rigid body 2D. Then I'm going to duplicate this enemy. I'm going to take one. Where are they? Right over here. I'm going to take one and move it down. When I hit play, because they are rigid bodies with colliders, the physics engine will cause them to fall because of gravity. Boom. Because you have to remember, while we're considering our space shooter from kind of a top-down point of view, really the y-axis is up and downness. Therefore, gravity should pull things to the bottom of the screen. Now, I'm going to take the bottom enemy over here. Its gravity scale, I'm going to set it to 0. It will no longer be affected by gravity, but it is still a physics object. If I hit play, the top one will still fall because it's still affected by gravity. And then because of inertia and whatever, it's going to go ahead and move the other one. If I move them over to sort of just where it'll clip the corner, it might even look a little bit better. Boop. There we go. And you'll notice the other guy, especially if I zoom out, because there's not really any drag here, it'll continue to kind of move on indefinitely. It's not affected by gravity, but, you know, inertia will do what it's supposed to do. Those are colliders. Colliders, which are the boxes around here, because I gave them box colliders. Colliders are what Unity uses to determine collisions when things are moving using the physics system. We are not moving things using the physics system, and I will demonstrate that right now. The top enemy, I'm going to make it so it's no longer affected by gravity by doing this. Okay? But these are still physics objects. If anything were to hit either one of these two guys, they would then bounce away. Now, my ship has no collider at all, so we can still pass through everything. So let's take my player ship, and let's add and we're going to use a box collider for now. We're going to replace these colliders later on. So now we've got a collider on the ship. Now I'm going to move, and, well, yeah, all right, that kind of works. It's a little weird, but what's going on? All right, we're gonna go through a quick little thing here. Normally, things that do not move, so we're talking about like platforms and walls, those are the only things in Unity that should have a collider and nothing else. These are considered static colliders, and they're not supposed to move. The Unity engine optimizes things based on the assumption they do not move. Colliders intersect each other physically. Although here, yeah, anyway, moving on. Colliders intersect each other physically. They collide. They hit one another. Rigid bodies are things that give objects mass and cause them to follow the laws of physics, which is to say they get affected by falling objects. Now, one thing to note, if I took this guy here and put him and made him affected by gravity again, if he were to fall, he'll hit the spaceship and then just stop there, because my spaceship here is supposed to be a static object. It does not have a rigid body, so it doesn't move by force. It's like the same thing as a wall. It's a static object over here. Okay, so colliders are for things that collide. Rigid bodies are for things that move. Now, normal rigid bodies are things that move under the physics engine. There's also two variants of both colliders and rigid bodies, which is triggers, which is just activated by the isTriggers box, and kinematic objects. Kinematic objects are objects that you want the physics engine to keep track of, but are still not affected by forces. So, what's the difference? So, my player ship over here, which had a box collider, again, ignoring the fact that it's a player ship. Let's just say this was a second wall. By not having a rigid body, but having a box collider, this is something the physics system expects to never move. It's a static collider. If I go and give my spaceship a rigid body and set it to kinematic, this is an object the physics system realizes can move. It doesn't obey any laws of physics, but it might move. This is something that you would normally use for maybe something like a moving platform. Okay? We can have this object sort of move like this, and it continues to affect the physics system, but it itself is not affected by the laws of physics in any way whatsoever. Then finally, there's colliders. Triggers. Triggers, which I've just set my spaceship to be a trigger now. Triggers do not interfere with physics in any way whatsoever. They don't affect the flow of physics object, but they realize when a physical object moves through them. So we're going to go ahead and showcase this. We're going to make it so that if the player... Actually, maybe we should make the bullets first. No, it's so fine. It's fine. We're going to make it so that if the player runs into the enemy, it dies. So here's the thing. In our particular version of things, nothing is going to be a regular rigid body. Everything will be kinematic triggers. The reason is we're not using real physics to move things around. What we want our rigid bodies and our box colliders, or our colliders, to exist for, are simply to tell our script, this bullet just ran into this alien. What should happen? Well, the answer is not that the bullet should, physically move the alien. No. What should happen is the alien should lose a hit point. And if it runs out of hit points, then the alien should explode. That is what we want to happen. We're not doing real physics. Now, doesn't mean you couldn't throw in some physical effects, for particles and explosions, different things like this. But our actual system here doesn't need physics. Just like if an enemy runs into our player, the type of game I'm imagining, which might be different from the type of game you're planning on making, the player shouldn't get bumped. It should take damage. It should lose hit points. Maybe it'll do that flashy invulnerability period for a little bit of time. That sort of thing. That classically happens in these arcade games. So that's why everything are going to be triggers. But if I just had a box collider and a trigger on all my objects, that would not be enough. They also need the kinematic rigid body to actually set each other off. And I could show that, and I will show that in just a second. Let me get rid of the second enemy. Just this top enemy over here. We're going to give it a script. We're going to create a script called what? Damaged by collisions? Maybe? Damaged by collision? I guess? Yeah, that should be okay. We're going to drop that on the enemy. So what is the script going to do? Well, it's simply, right now, going to let us know when it happens to be collided with. So we'll notice there's two functions we can use at this point. There's on collision enter 2D. Got to make sure we're using the 2D version. So that is one. And we'll go debug.log collision. And on trigger enter 2D. And I'm going to put both of these in to showcase that we're going to be using one and not the other. Trigger. And now, assuming I've done that right, cross my fingers, I might have spelled things incorrectly. There we go. You can see it's calling trigger. It's not a collision. This is not a collision. This is a trigger. And here's really where it starts to fall short. If I were to turn these into regular collision boxes, right? So now they're not triggers. These box colliders are now actual colliders. Oh, nothing happens at all. Why is that? That's because kinematic objects, when they move, they do not trigger collisions. However, things can move into them. If I had the enemy, I made it non-kinematic, and had it fall onto the player, you can see that would trigger a collision. And if I back up at the player, another collision, another one, another one. But kinematic objects that move, they never trigger collisions, even if they're not set to a trigger. However, kinematic objects that move into a trigger will set off the trigger. Boop. There we go. So this is what we want, because we want to use code to determine what happens when a player bumps into an enemy. What should happen? All right, so we don't need this. This will never run. On trigger enter. This is what we want. So what are we going to do? Well, it's a good question. Maybe, I don't know. Instead of calling this damaged by collision, let me just rename this a little bit. Let's go into Unity over here. We're going to call this maybe damage handler or health. I don't know. Damage handler might be a better name. Now, here's something else that I get a lot of questions about. People will make a script with one name, and the class has a different name. This does not work. If we check enemy, you can see right here, the associated script can't be loaded. If we try to play, you'll get, what is going on? It's because the name of the class doesn't match the name of the file. Now, it does. There we go. And now we can get our warning again. Everything is good. All right, excellent. I think damage handler is quite nice. It's probably a more elegant way to describe what's going on. It also gives us a great excuse to do something like health equals 1. So some sort of hit point tracking maybe. So when something bumps into us, what if we do something like health goes down if health is less than or equal to 0, then die. Whoa. No, it's because it's auto-completed because I don't have the function yet. And we'll make a function called die, which does what? I guess it'll just destroy ourselves. Destroy game object. That's a reasonable start. So now if we bump into the alien, oh, it dies. And this frequently is what happens in these sorts of shooters. The player might lose a health, or lose some hit points at least, and usually the enemy is annihilated by one of these collisions. We could even change how much damage it takes from a collision. Maybe it takes different amount of damage from a collision versus a weapon. You know, maybe your regular bullets do 1 damage, and then later on you can upgrade them to like a turbo bullet that does 3 damage instead or something like that. But collisions always only do 2. You can imagine different ways of doing this. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to build it up a little bit as we go forward. So right now, if this enemy intersects with anything at all, it will die. It's not quite what we want because let's duplicate this. I'm using Control D to duplicate it. I'm going to hit play. I'm going to take this enemy and I'm going to run into the other one. Boop. Enemies probably shouldn't run into each other. Or they probably shouldn't die if they run into each other, classically in these sorts of things. They should be able to pass by one another. How do we fix that? Well, we can do some complicated mojo. We're in this on trigger enter. We can check to see if, if it's an enemy, then we ignore it or yada, yada, yada. But then what if this damage handler, maybe this damage handler will also be on our player. In fact, it probably will be. Then what do we do then? The best thing to do is to use layers. So you can see here, all of our objects are existing on a certain layer. By default, it's the default layer. Let's go and make this a little bit more explicit. So if I go here and go add layer, I'll get this layers and tags, or tags and layers system. And layers are exposed by default. So let's go and create some user-defined layers. So we're going to say something like player and enemy. So we're going to say that enemies can't collide with enemies, and players or player stuff shouldn't intersect with player stuff, which is to say when the player shoots a bullet, we'll probably have it be on the player layer, and that way the bullets that the player shoots can't freakishly hit the player itself. You can figure out, like, if we had some sort of weird homing missile or something like that, and somehow it was like looping around and happened to maybe clip the edge of a player, we probably don't want that to destroy the player. Or maybe you do. Again, I don't know what kind of game you're making. But here, okay, we've got these 2 layers. Then we need to tell the physics engine how these layers interact. So we go project settings, so edit, project settings, physics, and there's physics 2D. Now, in this particular example, what I'm doing, it actually doesn't matter which one you go to. We'll go to physics 2D. Both of them have this layer collision matrix. And what we're simply going to do is we're going to see player over here and player here. We're going to uncheck the box. Now they can no longer intersect with one another. And same thing, we've got enemy and enemy. So now we're going to do that. So enemies can't collide or trigger each other, and players can't collide or trigger each other. So now if I hit play and I grab one of these enemies and I try to slam it in, what? Why does it still happen? Because we forgot to actually assign these guys to the layers. You can see they're still in the default. So we're going to go enemy and enemy, and the player, we'll set it to the player layer. And now we're going to hit play. Let's try that again. Oh, nothing happens. And we're going to grab the player. Apparently I'm scaling it instead of moving it, but that's okay. Oh, player destroys everything. Hooray. Okay, that's good. Now the player should probably take damage from collision as well. On our player ship, let's go ahead and give it a damage handler component. Let's go ahead and hit play and then see what happens now when we run the player into an enemy. What is happening? Shouldn't the player be taking damage and dying? Oh, well that time it did, but it didn't kill anyone. What's going on? Well, the thing is that when you get this sort of trigger, one thing bumps into another, they go in sequence. So one object gets told about the trigger, and then the next object gets told about the trigger in some sort of indeterminate order, clearly. And if something gets destroyed by this collision, the second thing never gets informed that the collision is happening because it's no longer there. There's not a trigger. It's like they check. Basically, it's not that there's a collision event necessarily so much as like one thing checks. Am I currently touching anything? Yes, then I will do this thing. And then the next thing after that says, am I currently touching anything? Yes, then I will do this thing. And so the first one goes, am I touching anything? Yes, it dies. And then the second thing goes, am I touching anything? Nope, nothing here. So this is not quite working the way we want. Now, I will make a note that if we were using the physics system and the collision system, they would both get alerted. Probably, maybe not actually, if you destroy something right away. So what does this all mean? We don't want to die instantly. We don't want to die inside of this. What we're going to do instead is we're going to take this check here and we're going to move it into update. Actually, we could probably fixed update. Yeah, update is fine. So here's what happens. Inside of the, when we get triggered, we'll lose health. But it's not until update that we'll check to see if we're supposed to die. And the reason for this, unless I am wrong, all of the triggers are checked at the same time, either just before or just after an update. So now, unless I'm wrong, and I'm never wrong, they will both die! That's because the triggers happen, they resolve one at a time. First the player, let's assume first the player, although it might be the other way around, will check the collision and be like, yep, I hit something, let's set my health to 0. And then the next ship checks its collision status and says, yep, I'm colliding something, let's set our health to 0. And then in the next frame, they check to see if their health is 0, and then they die. Okay, that's better. That's probably a lot better for what we're looking to do. Also, we don't necessarily have to do this. We could do something like, when we get triggered like this, maybe we go into some sort of invulnerable state, right? Classically, that tends to be what happens. Let's go and set our health. First of all, my cat Gilbert is going to decide to play with his scratching post and get some attention. Hey, buddy. Hi, buddy. Yeah, see, that's what he does whenever he wants to get a little bit of attention. Oh, he loves it when I record. All right. So, public health. So we're going to go, sounds like a political policy. So we're going to change the player's hit point to 2. So now let's see what happens. I can bump into the first guy. Oh, if I look at my player, my health is now 1. I've gone down. If I hit the second guy, then I will die. Well, that's cool though. I get the extra hit point. Now, what if I give myself some sort of period of invulnerability? Gilbert, dude, you can settle down. It's okay. I'll put him upstairs after this video, I promise, guys. You could give him some sort of period of invulnerability. Something like float invuln, and you set it to 0. So when we take damage from a collision, what if we set invulnerability? We say, listen, we're going to have like, I don't know, a quarter second. Well, for testing purposes, I'll set it to 2 seconds of invulnerability. And then we say something like, we'll only do this if invulnerability is less than or equal to 0. Then we'll reduce health and set invulnerability. And then in our update, invulnerability minus equal time that delta time. So here's what's going to happen. When we hit someone, we're going to have 2 seconds of invulnerability where we can no longer be hit by entering into a collider. Let's take a look at what that does. So we're going to hit the first guy, and now we're going to hit the second guy. And we didn't die on the second collision. And that's because we were currently flashing and invulnerable. In the game, we'd be flashing and invulnerable. But the problem is, when you're flashing and invulnerable in these sorts of games, usually you can't just keep plowing through all the things. Usually you're just sort of like, you're just more like ethereal or ghostly. So what would we do for that? Instead of simply ignoring damage when we're invulnerable, what if, and I don't want to take this too far because it's getting a little too complicated, but it's one of those very common things. What if we go back to the, the tags and layer system? What if we create a layer called invulnerable. And then we specify in our physics 2D layer that invulnerable objects can't collide with anything. We just turn off collisions for invulnerable stuff. And then, what if when we get hit and we're invulnerable, what if we change our layer? Oh, yes, we can do something like that. So if we're invulnerable, if we're here, we're going to set our timer invulnerability, and we're going to do something like, because we can access our collider. Game object dot layer. We can set it to something. What do we set it to? Well, there's a few different ways that you can like correctly configure this. But if we look, not there. If we go to project settings, tags and layers, you can see that this is technically layer 10. So I think layer is a number. I might be lying to you, but I don't think I am. We can set ourselves to layer number 10. So let's see what happens if we do that. So now, we're no longer going to check this invulnerability timer. Right? So now, if we trigger something, we will lose health no matter what. But after the first collision, our player should change his layer to invulnerable. He did, and now he can no longer collide anything. Now that's great, but eventually we're supposed to run out of invulnerability, at which point we should go back to the player layer. So let's tick this off, tick that off, set invulnerability timer. Actually, let's change that to invuln timer. Change our layer. And then, if our timer is less than or equal to 0, then we want to change our layer back. Well, what is our back? Depends. Are we a player or are we an enemy? So let's go ahead and set a start function over here. So we're going to set int correct layer. In our start, correct layer is going to be gameObject.layer. So when we run out of invulnerability, we're going to set ourselves back to our correct layer. So now let's set our invulnerability timer to something probably better, like a quarter of a second. So you're going to have to watch very carefully over here. The layer, if I move, I'm going to bump, it's going to turn to invulnerability and then go right back to player. There you go, after just a quarter of a second. So if I line things up, it'll be a little tricky. Let's line things up this way and then try to see if we can just slam through both. Oh, okay, we can't quite make it through to the other side in time. Our invulnerability runs out before we get there. So I'm going to say maybe something like a half second of invulnerability. You don't want to take like too much redundant thing. Also, there we go. We get almost halfway through the other one before it wears off. Should it be longer? Should it be shorter? I don't know. Maybe it should be. There should also clearly be an animation, but that's going to be a little outside the scope of this. But the last point I want to make for these kind of games is you generally, if we don't do this period of invulnerability, then what can happen is every frame, click, 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 30 or 60 times a second, the things will lose hit points. And generally that's not what you want, not if the player is supposed to have a lot of hit points or you're running into a tougher enemy or a boss or something like that. You generally want to sort of spread out the damage so that, you know, at most you can apply this sort of collision damage every half second or something like that. So we'll leave it in there. I'll kind of leave in more details as an exercise to the viewer. God, I hate when things do that. So with that though, let's go ahead and finish up. We've got a little bit of time left. Let's throw some bullets into this game. So our player ship, we've got our, let's look at all the components. We've got the player movement, the box glider, the rigid body, the damage handler. So we need to have some sort of function that allows us to shoot. We could add it to the player movement script, but let's go ahead and create a new script just to keep things a little cleaner, a little bit more minimal. We'll have player shooting. We'll open this bad boy up and we will, Gilbert, buddy. Aw, what a poor guy. We are going to open this bad boy up. Hi, I know you're hungry, aren't you? I will feed you right after this video. I promise, buddy. We are going to do what? We're going to check to see if the player is shooting. So, do we have an axis for it? Yes, we do. If we go to player or edit project settings input, you can see we have a fire 1 axis. It's currently set to the left control button and mouse 1. And I'm not happy with that. Let's go ahead and change it to, because it's not a mouse-driven game. Let's change it to spacebar, which technically jump is also bound to that, but it's okay. You can have more than one thing on there. So, fire 1 is space and left control. That seems reasonable. So it is an axis, but these are also buttons. Obviously, we don't care about like +1 to 0 to -1. in our fire axis. It's not the same as our movement. So here we're going to want to do input.get button. We don't want to say get key, because get key would require that we specifically name a key, like the space bar. But here we can say get button fire 1. If get button fire 1 is what? Well, this is if it's being held down. Do we want that? Do we want get button down? It depends very much on the kind of game you make. If you use input.get button down, then what you're going to require the player to do is mash the button over and over to shoot, that sort of thing. Maybe that's what you want. Maybe it's not what you want. I don't know. I'm not you. We're going to use get button. Get button requires that the player simply hold down the button, which honestly, from someone like me who gets a little bit of carpal tunnel, I appreciate this a lot more. If the button is being held down, then we shoot. Now, right now this would fire every single frame. That's not what we want. We want a tiny bit of a cooldown. So let's do that. Let's do something like cooldown timer equals 0 to start off with. So every frame, what we'll do is something like cooldown timer minus the time.delta time. So we're going to remove the amount of time that is spent since the last frame. If the button is being held down and the cooldown timer is less than or equal to 0, then we're allowed to shoot. And the very first thing we'll do when we shoot is we'll set the cooldown timer to whatever the time is supposed to be, which we should probably, do something like public float fire delay. And we'll have it default to, a tenth of a second. So pretty machine gunny, maybe a quarter of a second. So we're going to reset the cooldown timer to the firing delay. And then we're going to have it spawn some bullets. And now, yeah, that's going to be long enough. So when we come back, we're going to talk about what does it mean to shoot? What does it mean to spawn or instantiate a bullet? How does that work? See you next time, folks. Bye-bye.